Year 2016 is with us now, and as our first program for the new year, we are bringing to you a two-part show. First one on diplomatic and international relations issues, and also second one on the economic and business issues that Korea and the world face ahead. So please join us at Upfront.
튼튼한 안보는 국가 발전의 가장 기본적인 토대입니다. 빈틈없는 안보 태세로 북한의 도발에는 단호하게 대응하면서 대화의 문은 항상 열어놓고 평화 통일의 한반도 시대를 향해서 나아가겠습니다.
New Year, a time for making plans, mapping out the future. After the many ups and downs of the past year, what new issues will we have to tackle in the year 2016? Upfront takes a look at the political, diplomatic, and security events scheduled for 2016. First of all, North Korea's Kim Jong-un regime enters its fifth year in 2016. Since the cancellation of momentous inter-Korean talks scheduled for the end of last year, concerns have been raised over the souring of inter-Korean relations. For 2 years in a row, the UN General Assembly has been adopting resolutions that call on the dictatorship to be brought to the International Criminal Court. The international community has imposed stronger pressure on North Korea after the breakdown of the inter-Korean talks. The possibility of strategic provocation from the North, including a long-range missile launch and nuclear test, has been raised. The second biggest issue in the field of diplomacy in 2016 would be Korea-Japan relations. Korea and Japan's foreign ministers held crucial talks on Japanese wartime sexual slavery, which has been the biggest issue on the bilateral relationship in the past year. Through this meeting, Korea and Japan reached an agreement on the issue of Japanese wartime sexual slavery. As the trilateral summit between Korea, China, and Japan is scheduled to take place in Japan this year, there is a high chance that President Park will make her first visit to Japan. The international community is keeping a close watch on the future of Korea-Japan relations. The biggest global issue in the year 2016 will be international security and the fight against terrorism. Global outrage was a reaction to the senseless attacks by ISIS in Paris last year. The French government took military action against the ISIS, and leaders around the world gathered to condemn terrorism and take collective action.
Qui nous combat parce que la France est un pays de liberté, parce que nous sommes la patrie des droits de l'homme.
My firm conviction is that we need to act against ISIL in Syria.
The growing threat of terror is also expected to have an impact on the upcoming U.S. presidential election in November. Along with the rising threat of terrorism and a mounting sense of unease within the U.S., public opinion appears to be shifting in favor of the Republican Party, which has a conservative stance on security. The fear of terrorism has become one of the biggest variables in the field of global diplomacy and security. This year will be marked by huge events shaking up global dynamics. Upfront discusses the outlook on global security and diplomacy in the year 2016.
And for our first part here, discussing diplomatic and international relations issues, we have two guests in studio here. First of all, Professor Kim Eun Mee, Dean of Graduate School of International Studies of Ewha Women's University. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
And also Professor Kim Tae-hyun of Chung-Ang University. He was also a president of the Korean Association of International Studies last year. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Okay, let's start by talking about the big issues here, Professor Kim Eun Mee. What are some of the major top issues you see as, the diplomatic and international relations issues that Korea and the world face in this new year?
As we start the new year in 2016, On January 2016, we'll start the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which were agreed upon at the UN Assembly in 2015. So we're going to start a new era of sustainable development goals where we're going to focus on social, economic, environmental development of the world. I think that is a major issue. In April, we'll have the Nuclear Security Summit, and in May, we'll have the Climate Action 2016 Summit. So quite a few summits are planned this year.
And relating to what you just said, perhaps what was agreed in Paris last month in December about the climate change cooperation, I'm sure they will make a big role in terms of making all those cooperation programs that you discussed even more meaningful this year.
Even more meaningful, and hopefully we will move forward with implementation plans, strategies for implementation, not just about talking, but now since we have agreed, we now need to move forward working together to work on climate change and deal with climate change very effectively.
Right. Professor Kim Tae-hyun, I guess as an expert on international cooperation and development, Professor Kim Eun Mee sees a lot of issues in terms of the interaction between developing and developed countries here. But we have a lot of conflictual issues too, right? Such as terrorism and global security and so on. And of course, we have our own diplomatic issues surrounding Korean Peninsula. What are some of the key issues that you see for the new year for Korea?
Well, that's a very tough question. Think of some issues that had happened in 2015, say IS attack on Paris or Great Power. I mean, even the conclusion of TPP, that was unexpected cases. So there are so many development. There are some things that we can expect or anticipate, or some of things that we cannot expect or anticipate it. So what I'm worrying really is that the terrorism, possibly the terrorist attack that is going on. And also what really worries me is about great power competition for power and influences. Say the Syrian issues, US and Russia over the Ukraine issues, or AIIB versus TPP between United States and China. And so that is kind of traditional, but still very important issues coming on. On the other hand, as just Professor Kim Eun Mee just mentioned about the need for global governance, like a development agenda, climate changes, or common front for terrorist attacks. All these will determine and shape the years to come.
And then relating to what you just mentioned, Professor Kim Tae-hyun, in the United States, for instance, it's just the one example. They're talking a lot about clash of civilizations, as a result of this IS attacks and so on. Prominent politicians talking a lot about, how Islam could be an enemy to the Western civilization and all that. What do you see this year? I mean, Paris Agreement that Professor Kim Eun Mee mentioned could be an indication that there is a possibility, at least on the government levels, there is a possibility for greater cooperation between North and South, or developed or developing world. But on the other hand, do we see continuous conflict growing even further in terms of a conflict between so-called civilizations? By the way, about which I don't agree with, but.
Yeah, I don't agree with it. That civilization, conflictual civilization, something like that. But still, there's a political issues, and it will have huge political ramifications. Let's say the Syrian issue developed as a civil war inside, but it entangles great powers like Europe or United States on one hand, and Russia on the other hand. They have the political stakes on there. That leads to the rise of IS and IL. That leads to the population movement, the refugee issues, which entangles the European country into their own conflict. So many issues are so closely interconnected that it is very hard. So unless great powers foster some kind of wisdom, and need for cooperation to manage the world into peace, we may have some difficulty ahead in this.
Right. So in fact, the list of topics that we can potentially deal with in this program is so long here. China, Korea, of course what we have in mind is Korea-China FTA that was signed and agreed and implemented last year. And also China is showing all these different actions in all different dimensions, right? On the military side, they're setting up this presence on the South China Sea, but at the same time on the economic side, the AIIB trying to help developing countries and so on. What do we see in terms of China's first of all, Korea-China relations, Professor Kim Tae-hyun, what do you see this year in terms of any new developments or continuation of the key points? What do you see?
I mean, 2015 may be characterized as Korea being squeezed between United States and China, as they have difficulties over those issues like AIIB or South China Seas. That kind of trend will continue in 2016, but we cannot say take a side with one of those great powers because too important for us. As far
in that sense, do you think last year was a success year for Korea?
I think so. I mean, we are taking side issue by issues, not the overall size. So, so I mean, we are successfully have changed the kind of our discourses. Simply looking at those bilateral issues between China and United States from the geopolitical spaces, but we issue by issues, like AIIB, that is development issues, economic issues, South China Sea issues is more like military issues. We can take each different side. So that shows our independent foreign policies. That's I think that's a good thing. But still, China is very important in terms of our economic relations as well as China's leverage over North Korean issues. And North Korea is still too important for us, all those kind of things. So our government will try to manage our relations with China in a very careful way and good way. So I think that's going to continue. At the same time, from China's perspective, Korea is too important for them to lose. So I mean, we will enjoy what our Foreign Minister Yoon said. Being having love course from both sides will be a blessing. So whether we can make it a blessing or curse is to see. But I think we will do it well. And also, as far as I mean, one tendency in China's foreign policy is that it is moving away from bilateralism or unilateralism into more multilateralism. They could have used the huge economic resources for bilateral purposes, say giving aid or something like that, but they turned into AIIB, which is a multilateral institutions that is in line with existing institutions. That is good. Also, in response to TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnerships, China proposed Asia Pacific.
They have proposed several different things, like RCEP and then the Asia-Pacific trade zones, and
that's what Asia-Pacific. I mean, they try to want to make APEC into greater mega FTA. So this is also a movement toward multilateralism. So that is really in the principal market economies and or liberal economic principles. So I think that movement is a kind of positive trend.
I think it's an interesting point that he pointed out China's movement towards multilateralism because last month in December, when Paris Agreement was reached, there were observations that in Paris, China was acting quite differently from what we saw in their behavior in coming up with AIIB. That is, in Paris, China was very adamant that they're a developing country and they are willing to contribute to what they initiated as a South-South Climate Fund, but they're not going to contribute to, what is it, like $100 million, the new fund that UNFCCC was to create because they don't want to be viewed as a developed country. What do you think in terms of his observation that China is moving towards multilateralism? Do you agree with that?
I think they're in the process of transition. I think they're much more comfortable as a bilateral negotiator, but they're slowly moving into the multilateral stage.
Multilateralism that they like. And that they initiate, is that right? No?
No, not necessarily. At the UN SDGs and preceding that, in Busan, we had the high-level forum on aid effectiveness in 2011. That is the highest ministerial level aid meeting. That was the final one in 2011. That was the first time that China endorsed the final document, and that was a signal, even in the foreign aid area, that China is going to step up and is going to work with the traditional donors. And that was a sign for me to see that, okay, China is slowly trudging into the multilateral field and even for poverty reduction for the world. And they're continuing that stance, although they're has not declared any wish to join the OECD's Development Assistance Committee. They do have working groups with OECD DAC, so they are working and they are listening to us. So it has been interesting to see China coming slowly into the multilateral stage. But on the other hand, they're also caught in the domestic politics, so they're not able to move forward aggressively in certain fronts because of domestic constituents and so on. So I think they're moving toward that area. How fast or how aggressively they will move, it's a question. But in addition to what Professor Kim said, they are also moving into multilateral settings that they did not create.
So one of the key words or key theme agreed today in this program is China moving towards multilateralism. That's a very important point indeed. But let's also jump across the ocean and talk about Japan here. Japan was in a very interesting situation last year, right, in many different ways. They were part of, they teamed up together with the United States and introduced TPP and did all this interesting international things. But at the same time, in terms of bilateral relationship, they were not extremely successful in solving the tensions with Korea, even though there have been some progress. Related to that point, Professor Kim Tae-hyun, the military and security side, I wonder, this is starting from March, they'll have to implement this so-called collective security arrangement and they'll have to participate in activities. What do you see ahead? Are there any sticking, tumbling points ahead for Japan's ambition here? What do we see in terms of reactions from neighbors as well?
Well, when Japan tried to de facto change its Article 9 that prohibits the war act and so on through the legislation, many in Korea thought that maybe the first step toward real revision of the Article 9 to make Japan as a normal state, even in military affairs. That is a big worry for us. From Japanese perspective, when I met my Japanese friend, they said that is the limits. I think by passing those security-related laws, they will put a kind of covered the need for constitutional changes. So I mean, after that, if it's a limit, then Japanese it's a military assertism, which we worry it has already hit the limit, and so there will be less worry than we have thought. That is from Japanese interpretation. I hope so. I don't know.
Okay, you're talking about the bottom and the cap, so looks like this year will be a little bit in control than what we have seen in the past several years here.
Let me just add one more point. In December 2015, I went to Japan to attend a conference. And in the audience, there was a Japanese scholar who was concerned about the new law and was concerned that the peacekeeping operations or humanitarian assistance, where sometimes the military is asked to come in to provide security and so on, that the military aid or military support will be mixed up with development aid. So he was very concerned that people in the development community in Japan were concerned that this new law might take that route as well when they go to developing countries. And that's certainly a big concern and worry.
Professor Kim Tae-hyun, the InterKorean Relations we need to talk about. Last month in December, the vice ministerial level talk kind of broke down. It was a little bit of surprise because a lot of people are saying, well, there will be an agreement, whether it's watered down or really strong agreement, most likely watered down agreement, but there will be an agreement. But at the last minute, it kind of fell apart, and also there was thing happening in Beijing, right? The North Korean performer group abruptly canceling their schedule and so on. So as we start new year here, InterKorean relations and North Korean issues, there seems to be some concern here whether the period of tension may be coming back. What is your observation?
Well, I think the breakup of that December negotiations is not really final say to any dialogue. This is kind of initial stages where two parts plays a kind of game that play upper hand in that. So I think it will come back. I mean,
it was just one point of continuation.
Right. Yes, that's my expectation. But still, in that bargaining process, anything can happen. But we remember what happened last August of 2015. There was a war scare and then dramatic turnarounds. And that set up a kind of momentum towards more like a major bilateral relations. Big question is whether it leads to very thorny issue of North Korea denuclearization. the U.S. and Korea has been taking the stance that we won't have any genuine dialogue without North Korea's commitment to denuclearization, prior commitment to denuclearization and whatnot. But now President Park Geun-hye has only 2 years remaining, and we cannot just, time is passing away and the world is changing so rapidly. So somehow we will need to pull North Korea out of the South relation into some kind of dialogue, not only with South Korea, but also with the world, so as to turn North Korea into a more responsible member of international community. That is really good for North Korea government as well, people, and of course South Korea and Korean Peninsula in general. So.
About denuclearization, Professor Kim Tae-hyun, that being as a precondition for true improvement for the inter-Korean relations, don't we have to recognize that requirement has subtly kind of diluted or softened out a little bit throughout Park Geun-hye administration's reign? At the beginning, very strongly precondition, and now more recently it has become less of a precondition. Is such observation fair?
Yeah, I think making it a precondition is a kind of early stage of bargaining. That may be a bargaining strategy, but not really. Over the years, as dialogue continues, still, it was commitment to domestic constituencies, but now I think it's gonna have some kind of, a little bit of, let's say, compromises or something to generate some kind of real results. So, no matter what, we cannot go with North Korean inter-Korean relations without having that issue solved or committed to resolutions. So I think it should be processes. The denuclearization process as well as the improvements of inter-Korean relations should go together as a package. I think that kind of package will be developed and put into action in this year.
Okay, we will try to wrap up our discussion here by covering one or two remaining issues here. Professor Kim Eun Mee, as we know, towards the end of the year last year, Ambassador Chae Kyung-nim, the head of permanent mission in Geneva, has become the head of United Nations Human Rights Council, becoming active this year.
Right.
What does it mean in terms of for Korea and perhaps inter-Korean relations as well, and Korea becoming more active in the global stage?
Right. In addition to Ambassador Chae, we have Ambassador at the UN as heading the ECOSOC from last year. So we have quite a few high-ranking Korean diplomats serving on various UN committees as chairpersons or committee chairs. So it is a sign that Korea is really going to continue to play a very important role in multilateral settings, and they're leading in some cases. So it's a very welcome sign that we have been pushing for quite a few years, that it's finally coming to fore. What they bring to the table, I think, is Korea and Asia's own experience and our own voices of what we see from this part of the world and how we would like to see peace and prosperity on the world. On issues like terrorism, human rights, Asia has its share of issues, but perhaps we need to coordinate with the multilateral issues very carefully. In terms of terrorism, although luckily we're not seeing a lot of that here in this peninsula, there are signs that it may be closer than we think, and with these random attacks, it's a worrisome sign, and the global community has to get together. On the other hand, and perhaps because of this, there's great humanitarian needs around the world, and the Human Rights Council and so on need to work very carefully, closely on this. And going back to the ECOSOC,
ECOSOC meaning the Economic Social Council that Ambassador Oh Jun is heading.
Right. We have to remember that the rise of terrorism coincided with the rise of inequality around the world. So we must be aware of some connections between these issues of global inequality. We should be more concerned about the global community as a whole. Think about poverty alleviation around other parts of the world, even if you're not, you don't have poverty in your own country. But we are also seeing inequality growing within countries. So dealing with global inequality, dealing with domestic inequality, these are intertwined problems, very difficult, but we need to tackle this. And I think SDGs was suggested as that, and I hope we can really move forward on that front. Otherwise, these other very extremist tendencies for terrorism and so on may continue.
So 2016, you have just made a year fully loaded with development issues, cooperation issues. Korea is going to be very busy. But as a wrap-up, Professor Kim Tae-hyun, what do you see in terms of the main focus, in addition to what Professor Kim Eun Mee said, in terms of its diplomatic policy and international relations policy for the new year?
At the beginning, I said that there is a two trend. One is a great power competition of influences, power in the world on one hand.
Right.
On the other hand, great need for cooperation among national actors on global governances. And in South Korea, our country is a kind of middle-level countries. And if we are embroiled in great power competitions, it's a very dangerous issue. On the other hand, on the global governance issues, there are a lot of rooms to play, like as norm setters and abiding by universal values and so on. So that is kind of what is called middle power diplomacy. So by playing the game where we can play well, we can dilute the pressures from the great power competition. So that is the direction that we have been following and will have to go in the futures as well.
Wonderful wrap-up for our first part of this program where we've been talking about diplomatic and international relations issues. So I want to thank big time for our prominent panel members today. And also, we want to ask our viewers from all around the world to stay with us because we still have second part of the show coming up discussing economic and business issues. So please stay tuned.
Three major issues are expected to shake the global economy in the new year. The first is the U.S. interest rate hike. At the end of last year, the U.S. Federal Reserve announced that it will raise interest rates for the first time in 9 years and 6 months. The zero interest rate policy of the U.S., which has been in place for the past 7 years, has finally come to an end.
This action marks the end of an extraordinary 7-year period during which the federal funds rate was held near zero.
The U.S. rate hike is expected to further strengthen the U.S. dollar, the key currency of the global economy. A strong dollar would further lower the prices of oil and raw materials, dealing a blow to oil producers and emerging countries dependent on raw material exports. The risk from emerging nations has strong implications for Korean economy, which relies on them for 50 to 60% of its exports. Some turbulence in the international financial market is expected from the U.S. rate hike this year. The next key global economy issue is a slowdown in Chinese economic growth. At the end of last year, economic forecasts said that the era of 7% economic growth in China has come to an end. Most institutions foresee a Chinese economic growth of about 6.5%, including the OECD placing Chinese growth at 6.5%, and the IMF, which has cut its forecast to 6.3%. China has a strong influence in the global market. 44 countries around the world, including Korea, which have China as their biggest importer, will be burdened by the decrease in exports caused by the slowdown of the Chinese economy. From developing countries expecting investment from China, advanced countries whose capital markets are strongly connected to the Chinese economy, to the all countries who are competing with Chinese yuan, are going to be directly affected by the Chinese slowdown. The last variable that has to sway the world economy is instability in the European economy. Brexit, which means British withdrawal from the European Union, has been one of the biggest risk factors threatening the European economy. The European region has faced political and geopolitical threats with last year's refugee crisis and terror attacks. Unemployment figures have risen as job seekers from other EU countries have come to the UK. Coupled with a rising burden of providing welfare to immigrants, Euroscepticism or anti-European sentiment has been expanded among the British. As British Prime Minister David Cameron plans to carry out a referendum over EU membership this year, controversy is expected to ensue over the possible Brexit.
Finally addressing the concerns of the British people about our membership. Then it will be for the British people to decide whether we remain or leave.
Although the actual possibility of Brexit is still uncertain, other EU member states will be put under strong pressure by the presence of controversy itself. Year 2016 has begun with huge risks from the US rate hike and slowdown of the Chinese economy. Upfront presents an in-depth analysis of the expected risk factors in the global economy and ways to tackle these challenges.
Welcome back to Upfront. This is second part of this year's first program here Upfront. And for our discussion of economic and business issues, we have two panel members in the studio. First, Professor Jeong Hyeok, professor at Graduate School of International Studies of Seoul National University. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And Professor Yukiko Fukagawa, professor of economics at Waseda University and currently visiting professor at Yonsei University. Welcome
Thank you
to the
very
program.
much.
Thank you. All right, we have a lot of ground to cover here, but first of all, as we did during the first part of the show, I want to start by asking you the big issues for the year, this year, 2016. Professor Fukagawa, what do you see in terms of both Korean economy and global economy? What are some of the top big issues for the year?
Well, I think there seems to be a lot of consensus, especially among the economists, saying that after all, U.S. is going to resume their financial policies, and while China is suffering from restructuring process.
Right.
So how the two big economies is going to manage the whole global pictures is one thing, and also still EU economies and Japanese economies are suffering to recover from all the massive monetary easing process, and then there's a U.S.-China economy. So that's all the diversities, and there's speculations that probably we won't be able to have a nice dialogue among those four.
Right, right. I see. A very exciting prospect in a way, to put in a positive term here. Professor Jeong Hyeok, what do you see in terms of like a major economic issues in addition to what Professor has just mentioned?
Professor Fukagawa already mentioned the important things, but if I need to add, perhaps the responses of the Western world to the IS terrorism may be another important thing, and also the policy coordination among the G7, because as Fukagawa already mentioned, there may be a divergence because U.S. is recovering, so it's going to tighten its monetary and perhaps the fiscal policy, but the rest of the G7 should do the opposite way. So how will they cooperate or coordinate about the policies? Maybe another one. And also, I heard there's a discussion about euro because of the last year's experience about the Greek kind of crisis.
They have Grexit, and now they're talking about Brexit.
Yeah.
Right.
So I think it depends on how the Germany is responding to those crises. So watching out those events is another important thing. And at this era of the new emerging economies rise, I think watching out those emerging economies' response to the a falling commodity price, including oil price, may be another important global issues to watch out.
To get back to your earlier points about how the world community responds to the IS threats here, what are some of the patterns of response that could be positive for the economy and business? What are the things that the world community can do for the positive impact on economic side? IS
positive side, I guess, actually there is a more dangerous side rather than the positive. I think the current Western world is in slippery slope. It can go to either way, actually. It can more tightens its restrictions about the international flows of people, like migration, or capital, the FDI, and also the goods and services, which is trade. So if they overshoot their responses, it's likely that the international flows of these resources may be restricted. If that happens, it may affect the entire whole world, not just the Europe.
Right.
So they need to think about this issue not from the point of like a revenge or it's a kind of war or the conflicts between two cultures. That can be very dangerous. So that way, the positive response those Western worlds can do is try to have more access to the other culture.
Oil price, this is interesting for Korea and Japan as well. Always falling oil price had been good news for our economies, but these days, since last year, 2015, the overall attitude has changed, and we are kind of like getting stressed out with the falling oil price. Professor Jeong Hyeok, what is happening here, and what are we expecting to see this year in terms of oil price?
I think this year, the oil price will continue to fall.
You think so?
I think so. At least this year and perhaps by the early, even next year, it may fall, even to the level of 25 or 26.
I see.
Because the forces behind this fall is rather systematic. One important reason is, as we all know, the shale gas. So we have a substitute. So the oil-producing companies has lost its bargaining power, basically. So that's one. The other one is...
But isn't it the case, maybe it's a speculation, but oil producers, big major oil producers around the world wanted to actually drive shale gas producers out of the market. That's why they drove the price down initially, maybe at the beginning of last year, 2015. But are you saying shale is still in the game? A lot of people thought that shale was out of the game because of this market practice.
I don't think so. Because U.S. has both. U.S. has Alaska. So it has oil and Texas oil and plus shale. So U.S. has a buffer to respond. So the driving out this shale out of the game was impossible. So, but once they started this fall in price, they are getting into the really the strange chicken's race, rat race. So I think that's still a big factor. And another one is a strong dollar.
I see.
Because the crude oil is quoted in dollar. And as the dollar becomes stronger, the oil price in the international market is supposed to fall. So that trend will continue this year as well.
So with the Fed, U.S. Fed action on U.S. dollar or the interest rate, and then U.S. dollar will add further pressure on already falling oil price, and then Iran is continuing to pump up, and other oil producers around the world in the Middle East region will continue to pump up the oil. Professor Fukagawa, but however, this means a lot of trouble, interestingly, for economies like Korea and Japan. What do you see ahead this year?
Well, unfortunately, the falling price of the oils and other commodities, and that is still imposing the downward pressure for the most mature economies trying to fight back against the deflationary pressures because the price continues to fall. And another thing was, as Professor mentioned already, the many emerging countries are very much dependent on the commodities and oils and gas or whatever. So their export is destined to fall. So that is to trigger another crisis for the whole
because
economy.
They're the ones who are buying Korean and Japanese products.
Well, at this moment, yes. Of course, the import, well, especially Korean won has been appreciated a little bit. So, but that's again exactly the same structures that Korean economies is undergoing some deflationary pressures because of oil, and it's quite similar with Japan.
Talking about the all this global challenge and changes. Last year, what we saw was the Chinese currency joining as a one important, symbolic act, joining a special drawing rights basket for the International Monetary Fund. What does it mean for all of us? Some people are saying we have a rise of new key currency for the world economy, perhaps replacing the Japanese prominence. Some of them were saying. Professor Fukagawa, share with us some more balanced, observation here about changing dynamics for the Chinese monetary and financial power that we saw last year, 2015, and what it means this year, 2016.
I think so-called rise of China has been very much politically exaggerated, and they're doing what they're supposed to do right now. And in terms of the size of the trade transactions by Chinese, I think Chinese yuan should be right to be admitted as SDR currencies. But on the other hand, they have a long way to go because, in terms of trade settlement, they've got such a large currencies already, but they are not completed all the liberalizations of capital transactions, and their domestic financial market is still very small, very shallow, so that they have a long way to go. And unless they don't have such a very mature, big and powerful capital transactions for the user side, there's very much limitations on by holding the Chinese yuan as a currency.
Professor Jeong, talking about China, Korea-China FTA that was agreed and signed and implemented last year, 2015, and are we expecting big, significant impact this year in terms of a rising trade between the two countries?
Well, the FTA, not just for Korea-China FTA, has a positive role that I believe. But in case of Korea-China FTA, there are many criticisms because its liberalization rate is much lower than expected. And also...
as low as many expected.
Okay, but even lower.
Even lower than that, okay.
Yeah, and one little worrisome part of Korea-China FTA is the liberalization rate is asymmetric across sectors. In particular, the electronics and also the petrochemical products, it's particularly low. And
which side? Explain to our viewers. Which side opens more? You mean depending on different industries?
Right.
Okay. I thought you were saying one country opens a lot on one sector.
No.
Okay. So the level is uneven depending on talking about different industries.
Yeah, it opened, but in a less open way. But there's a tricky part that China actually did. It is not that well known. Before the Korea-China FTA, and China was preparing the Taiwan-China FTA as well. Right. And when they were talking about China-Taiwan FTA, they made a special agreement of economic cooperation agreement, which agrees that China will give a particular advantages to Taiwanese products in both industries. Electronics and chemistry industries.
Will that then cause, according to what you said, will that then cause what a lot of economists and policy makers are fearful of? That is a so-called, what experts say, trade diversion, trade moving away from Korea-China trade to inter-China or the China-Taiwan trade? Are we going to be losing our trade?
Kind of.
Okay.
Because the Korea needs to compete in Chinese market with Taiwanese firms, but with unequal footing.
Even with Korea-China FTA, we will be still on disadvantageous side. Okay.
And that factor is one. And the other factor may be, well, by simply lowering the tariff, would Chinese people buy more of Korean products? That's also another issue, because if the Chinese consumption about Korean products may be saturated already. So if the trend is really linear, perhaps the Korean government's estimates of the growth effects like around 1% for the next 5 years may be realized, but if there's a saturation point for a given product, that may not be realized. So that way, I'm not sure if there will be the real expansion by the commerce point of view of Korean market in China. But I think the real effects of FTA is not about extending the markets. Actually, the true effect of FTA is promoting competition. So it really depends whether Korean companies will respond to that challenge in a more productive way or not. So just simply buying and selling, I don't think there will be not much change. But if Korean firms are facing a really big market and then trying to respond to opening such markets, and then the Korean economy may benefit from the productivity growth point of view. Yeah.
Keeping in mind that balanced view, together with some somber notes about the aftermath of KoreaChina FTA, Professor Fukagawa, Japan scored big time last year by being a part of and being an active member of TPP, getting it finished here. Do you see China and Korea possibly joining TPP this year? Or those two countries trying very hard to join TPP as a latecomer? What do you see in terms of China's efforts and Korea's efforts to join this vehicle that Japan in part created this year? I'm asking you to become a fortune teller here.
I think since Korea has a bilateral FTA with U.S. already, so it won't be that difficult for Korea.
Right.
But China still they need a lot of efforts to join the TPP
to come up to the level.
Yes,
to be qualified.
Because the TPP is the liberalization speed and the covered areas are so broad. So. If they just taken it as a challenge to the sovereignty or challenge to the rooms of the industrial policies, that is going to be very difficult for China. But in terms of Korea, it's nothing, just a slight bit. And the only thing for Korea is more with the U.S., but more with Japan, because virtually it's going to bring in the Korea-Japan FTA. So.
Let's switch our focus briefly to China. They set up AIIB last year, 2015, and I think they will have first projects coming in under AIIB. What do you see ahead in terms of AIIB's future in the region as well as in the world? I'm sure when you say that you will keep in mind the future of ADB in mind as well, ADB having been led by Japan mostly.
I think our professionals are all talking about the AIIB people, so there should be a lot of dialogue between ADB and AIIB already. And even Chinese side know very well that they have scarce human resources, professional human resources to deal on such a big development project.
So you see more cooperation between ADB and AIIB?
Of course. So it's not really such a big rivalry. Of course, there can be. But it's basically nicer for the developing countries' point of view that you have a different competitive counterparts that may cooperate you. So that's...
Professor Fukagawa is always ever peace-loving, calm person and optimist here. And I think it makes a lot of sense, right? Cooperation between AIIB and ADB rather than competition. I think it makes
And of course, there's
sense.
Ugly nationalism kind of sentiment.
That's something we need to overcome in this region for sure. Talking about regions, Professor Chung, we have to talk about EU issues. You know, we talked about Grexit and now talking about possibly Brexit this year as well. What do we see ahead in terms of the future of EU? EU has been causing so much trouble for the world last year and the year before. Are we going to have a better year this year?
As I mentioned earlier, I think it depends on how Germany would behave. Well, this EU issue has a deep-rooted history. Competition actually between Germany versus France or UK. And that way, Germany is in a very nice shape, actually. And from the long European historical point of view, the rest of the Europe tries to embrace Germany and put Germany in their own order, which is EU and the use of euro. But Germany has become a little more stronger than just getting itself confined in that order. So if that's the case, Germany needs to play the leader role there, but Germany is not doing that smoothly.
I see.
I think that's the cause of these all noises.
Professor Jeong, we have already kind of run out of time here, so we need your final word in terms of economic and business issues that Korea has to keep in mind and tackle or challenge ahead. Some final words here, please.
I think from Korea's point of view, Korea's point of view, it needs to think about what is the right strategy at this age of globalization. Simply pursuing FTA, for example, I don't think it's a good solution. It's rather focus on more on FDI and more on economic cooperation among Asian partners. But somehow the too much discussions are under the name of the FTA because Korea think it's the strength of Korean global strategy. But to be honest, I don't think so. It's a strength, of course, but there are much bigger potential to go through this age of the globalization to help not just the Korean economy but the entire Asia. And there is another big league, which is a group of developing countries, and cooperating with them properly will be a very important strategy for Korea.
Working with developing countries, large developing countries, and also paying more attention to FDI issues and so on.
And economic cooperation.
Economic cooperation, right. Professor Jeong has just mentioned, pay less attention on FTA, but the only major ones that's remaining on the table is one with Japan. So I don't know what his implication here is. But Professor Fukagawa, not on that point, we have to wrap up this program, unfortunately. As an expert on Korean economic structure and economic reform and so on, some of your final words as a wrap-up as we look ahead for the new year 2016.
I think this year can be the year for geopolitics because, well, all there's a divergence of the directions of every different regions. We have some specific geopolitics among Japan, Korea, China, and we can do lots of things together. For instance, well, Japan and Korea should be a partner for the positive deregulation, sharing their experience of the aging society, or the pressure for the further innovation because we are not the cheap wage countries anymore. So these are the things. And of course, we are in a position to support the Chinese soft landing for the whole restructuring process because we are already involved in the Chinese economy anyway, far deeper than US or Europe. So we are pushing the China's successful trials for the soft landing into the new normal situation.
Right. Those are very important words being shared by Professor Fukagawa and Professor Jeong Hyeok. Thank you very much for sharing your wonderful insights today.
Thank you very much for inviting us.
And viewers, as you might have noticed, this year we face a lot of challenges ahead of us here in Korea as well as around the world. And for that reason, we want to ask you to stay with us here in this program Upfront. So we will continue to deliver to you important discussions and talks about global as well as Korean issues years ahead, and particularly this year. So once again, looking forward to an important year with all of our viewers who are joining us from all around the world. This has been Upfront. Thank you very much.